For tonight's Oasis podcast, we have two featured guests, Dr. Michael Lossoff, who is the Director of Staff Development at Yellow Brick, which is a treatment center for young adults in Evanston, Illinois. Some of you are not in Illinois, so you may not be familiar with the program. And my associate, Jen Geringer, who is Oasis's lead employment well-being consultant, who has the unusual and valuable experience of having practiced for 20 years as an employment attorney. So she brings to bear a lot of appreciation of the dynamics of the workplace, the challenges of the workplace. She also brings to bear her expertise in human behavior, since she has now become a licensed clinical social worker. So we are going to start with a question for you, Michael, because this whole program this evening started with an email that you circulated, and it caught my attention. I want to have you first say a few words about what was in the article that you forwarded around in that email. So just sort of give people the gist of it.
It was an article in Atlantic magazine, I think it was the April issue, called "Why Liberals Can't Quit the Lockdown." And it was largely about that, like what forces and what factors are making it, in particular, more difficult for liberals to be comfortable or follow what the CDC guidelines were, which is we could start taking off our masks, both outside and inside. And it was something that I was wrestling with a lot personally. And so I thought this article spoke to me, and I thought it would speak to other people as well.
What were you wrestling with?
And this is going back, I don't know, maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks now. When the CDC launches guidelines or announced its guidelines that you don't need masks inside or outside, my first reaction was, what? And even though, following the news, even though the rates of COVID had been going down, the transmission rates, and even though vaccine, the proportion of the population being vaccinated is going steadily up, especially in the area where we live in Evanston, it still just didn't feel right to me. I wasn't ready. It didn't feel right. It felt abrupt. And it was something I was wrestling with a lot. I would walk by places where there'd be people sitting outside in great groups or going inside, and it just didn't feel right to me. And so this article caught my attention for that reason.
So you were grappling with whether or not you were ready to follow the CDC's recommendations. And where did your reflection take you?
Well, I found the article helpful because it gave me pause to really ask the questions, why was I having such conflict, or why did I resist, in a sense, stepping back from the lockdown or quitting the lockdown? And it gave me a chance to think about that and to do some honest self-reflection. And, one thing the article said is that for people who are liberal, we have invested so much energy and effort into fighting what we perceived as an inadequate response or not full response to the pandemic, and our sense of when people wouldn't wear masks, that all of a sudden to hear, okay, now you can take off your mask, it was like I was already entrenched. That's a strong word. I was already entrenched in a certain way of thinking. And it wasn't just the facts, but it was the whole feeling. Mm-hmm. And it did help me. I said, well, okay, let's look at things objectively here. And, there was evidence that things were safer. And maybe I didn't need to be quite as vigilant. It doesn't mean I was ready to go and, go to Lollapalooza or anything like that. But it did help me look at things more objectively and maybe more rationally.
Mhm. So you mentioned in passing feelings you had about giving up your mask. So feelings like what?
Protected.
The mask made you feel protected.
Right. And maybe that I was, well, I can say two things. One, it made me feel protected and that I was still keeping myself safe, which I think is true. Also, it made me feel that I was part of a cause,
Mm.
part of a way of approaching the world that was more thoughtful, in my view, or vigilant or careful. It also, I think, was a way, and this is something the article pointed out, it also is a way for liberals anyway of identifying with what we understand are inequalities in how COVID hit different parts of the population. And so I guess in a sense, the mask felt like a symbol of some kind, felt like some connection to a general approach to the world, politically, socially.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things it makes me think about is that there's research that indicates that in the last couple of decades, and especially in the last few years, people have become much more identified with their political affiliation or where they fall on the spectrum. So like in the 1960s, if people were to sort of rank order, kind of how they thought of themselves, it would be like, gender, marital status, their career, maybe having kids, these kind of a list of other things. And like their political affiliation would be a minor consideration. And that has really shifted and intensified greatly recently, so that now where we fall in the political spectrum tends to feel important to who we are, right? It's not a kind of attribute that's sort of maybe casual or, something that we could sort of set aside or whatever. It tends to feel more essential. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think even before COVID, as you're saying, we've gotten ourselves in a spot where we're more tied to a particular political view or particular political philosophy and really holding on to that. And in a sense, what the pandemic did, because it decreased our sense of safety and increased our sense of anxiety, it probably exacerbated that sense of locking into your point of view. So as you're saying, in addition to identifying with a certain way of looking at things as being more important to us, it also became associated with feelings of safety and protection.
So those are like existential level concerns, right? The sense of sort of being threatened by the virus. But I think you're also saying threatened by others who see the world differently.
Yeah.
Have a different affiliation.
Yes.
Yeah. So you, I think, by virtue of sending this article around, you see problems, right, with this kind of investment attachment, right, to the symbols of things like a mask. Vaccination status is sort of in there too, but it's not as conspicuous, right? So what are your thoughts about why this is a problem? Like what are the implications of this?
The implications of sort of locking down with a certain viewpoint or a certain.
Yeah, and particularly in relation to masks, vaccination status.
Well, I can answer that in two ways. One, But just on a social level, I think it makes it more difficult for us to return to the group world. I mean, in some ways, we've all been living in our own little secluded universe, which, as much as we complained about it, probably felt okay at some level. And now it's time for us to go back into the world and start interfacing with people who may not look at things exactly the way we do. So, for example, over Memorial Day weekend, there was a family gathering for me, and I had to figure out how to hold, knowing I'm going to run into people who not only didn't necessarily believe in masks, but also didn't necessarily believe in vaccination. And even though I'm vaccinated, I had to figure out how I was going to handle that. So I think that's one problem. I think, or one avenue. I think another one is that, and we'll probably talk more about this as we go along, I think that we're all in some way traumatized, whether a big T, and I think there are people, of course, with the pandemic who were traumatized with a big T, that family members or friends who got sick or died.
Frontline healthcare workers.
Frontline healthcare workers, thank you. Yes, yes. But all of us have been traumatized by the shock of facing such a threat, and also by the political environment. And so taking off the mask or returning more back toward, quote, normal is like working through our trauma in a sense, and takes in the steps of, okay, I was injured, now I have to try and heal, or now I have to try and reintegrate myself, or now I have to try and reintegrate myself.
So there's not a lot of public discourse about trauma other than, people who have lost family members to COVID, or maybe they've had a traumatic experience of the illness, or they've, had to work on the front lines. So you're bringing this trauma lens. How can a trauma lens, which is specific to our field, really, how can a trauma lens help us understand what we've been going through and move forward in a way where we're not so much in the grip of the trauma?
Mm-hmm. Right. I think there's a researcher at UC Irvine, I think, who looked at PTSD, not really intense PTSD, but PTSD in the armed services. And she identified 3 factors that help sort of moderate the experience of trauma, and help moderate how we heal. And I think all 3 of them really apply to us right now. And I think it's a useful way to help us think about it. One is that if you have confidence or trust in authority, that helps you sort of manage the stress. And certainly these days, I think our confidence and trust in the political system and authority is really shaken, no matter which side of the aisle you're on, or which side of the political spectrum.
Including, I would just add, Michael, the CDC, right? The CDC
including
critical to
right.
the very set of questions, and people's confidence has been shaken, even recently with the most recent revisions to the guidelines.
Right. And it's a really fascinating, the CDC up until the pandemic, was considered like the world gold standard. No one questioned the CDC. Everybody knew that they knew what they were talking about, and they had our backs. Well, most people, there were some groups of people but now nobody believes the CDC, or everyone questions it. So trust and authority, I think, a sense of belonging is another one that she identified. And, we're all comfortable belonging to people who believe the same thing we do, but now we're being asked to return to a belonging. It's a greater conglomeration of people. And that's shaken us a little bit. I think a third factor is, if I can read my handwriting here, community solidarity. Similar to sense of belonging, a sense that we're all in this together, we're all in a community. And I think certainly right now our culture isn't feeling that way. So all of these things, which are identified as ways of helping moderate our response to trauma, are all present as we deal with returning back to life now that the threat of the pandemic is decreased.
So knowing what we know as mental health professionals, what would you say, Michael, and then I'll ask you, Jen, as well, how can we help people manage their anxiety? Sometimes it rises actually to the level of, I would call, outright fear, sometimes paranoia. I had a conversation with a client today who was saying that she fears she may never see her elderly grandmother again, who's vaccinated, as is my client. But her grandmother is so terrified, in spite of the vaccine, of having any contact with the outside world, that she is declining to meet her grandchildren. To see her grandchildren, my client said, I may never see my grandmother again. So that rises to kind of a paranoid level where it's like she's impervious to any sort of inputs about how the risks can be mitigated, the risks have been reduced, that kind of thing. So there are some people who are really, really, really fearful. Then there are others who have sort of more like low level anxiety about starting to go out into the world. So how can somebody who's feeling anxious about starting to go out into the world, interact more, who's anxious, what would you suggest to somebody about how they could cope with that anxiety?
Well, I think even though it might sound jarring, thinking about this as trauma can be really helpful, because when you think about it, I had some kind of trauma I had to deal with, I had to face. We don't think of, okay, now I'm ready to walk out the door tomorrow and everything should be fine. So even framing it in a way of this was an intense traumatic experience, the small t in some cases, gives us a chance.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing there is that it can allow someone to essentially be more compassionate towards themselves, right?
Right, yes, and patient.
Mm-hmm.
And understand that this is a process that should take some time. While it might be nice to think about we can all start going to Lollapalooza, I still can't believe they're going to do that. So I can't, even given all this, I can't help myself. That it is going to take some time for us to get used to this. And we probably, I would guess, won't return to, there won't be the normal that we knew before. It'll be a different way of thinking about things. Mm-hmm. I think also, but I think you mentioned, Sarah, sort of self-compassion. That's a really important part of trauma healing, is to learn compassion for yourself and patience. And then I think another big part of it is knowing your own boundaries. So knowing where you do feel comfortable and where you feel uncomfortable, which again, of course, is also part of working with people who have been traumatized, is knowing how to set your own boundaries. So, for example, in this family party, I knew that I didn't feel comfortable getting really close to people who I knew weren't vaccinated. Whether or not that was physical safety or my political beliefs, probably a combination of both, but I knew that I just didn't want to give them a hug. And actually one of them actually came up to give me a hug and I had to kind of politely step back. Interestingly, that person rescued the situation for both of us by saying, oh, you're in the health field, I understand. So it was really an interesting exchange because there was a lot of discomfort there. And it's a woman I've known for a long time. And she, to my stepping back politely, she figured out a way to frame it so it wasn't a conflict. So knowing your boundaries and knowing where you're comfortable and not feeling that you need to go against your boundaries. So, well, my daughter was with a group of people last night and they went to a place that she didn't feel comfortable going to. And it was indoors, it was crowded, and so she politely excused herself. And so doing those kind of things.
Yeah. So another thing that we as mental health professionals have in our toolkit is mindfulness, right? We work with a lot of our clients on how to use breathing techniques, those kinds of things. So if you think about the kind of thing that somebody might do if they're finding themselves, let's say they're stuck in a situation where they can't just excuse themselves, right? Maybe it's their workplace, maybe it's an elevator, right? What might be a kind of go-to that you would offer somebody if they're kind of, in an uncomfortable spot where they're feeling anxious and they can't just excuse themselves?
Yeah. As trite as it might sound, take some deep breaths and notice your breathing. Give yourself some space to just tune into yourself. If you can't, maybe you can wait till the elevator door opens and then you can politely walk in the other direction. But I think that, in an immediate situation like that, I think that's one of the most important tools. And it sounds trite because we hear this all the time, but we hear it all the time for a reason, because it really can help. Just take some deep breaths, tune into yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's science behind the breath exercises that are kind of a cornerstone of mindfulness, and it's the reason why we hear so much about this, that actually part of what we're doing when we slow down our breathing is we're raising our CO2 levels in our blood. And when we raise our CO2 levels, we decrease the stress hormones in our body. There's an inverse relationship. It works,
Yes.
and it does come up a lot, but I don't think it is trite. I think it's a very real, scientifically based practice. Jen, you also have a toolkit of mindfulness techniques that you work with people to use when they're feeling stressed, fearful, anxious. So what would you add?
Well, so of course, my first go-to is breathing. That's by far, in my mind, the best grounding practice. Some other really good ones too are sort of physically taking note of where you are in space and grounding yourself through your five senses. And that can be as simple as running through a checklist in your head as you're feeling your anxiety levels build. What are 5 things I can see? What are 4 things I can hear? 3 things I can touch, 2 things I can smell, 1 thing I can taste. It sort of brings your awareness inwards and allows you to regroup. Another technique that I use a lot with my clients is emotion surfing. And that's being really honest with how you feel, knowing that in this moment, you're feeling something, you're feeling panic, you're feeling fear. The truth of it is these feelings run like a wave if you allow them to go all the way through. And so it's coaching yourself through it. It's allowing yourself to feel what you're feeling, to know that you're going to survive this moment, and to engage in some self-talk to sort of regulate yourself as you're going through that. And it can be as simple as a mantra that is saying to yourself, I've got this, I'm going to get through this. This is just a minute or 2. And it helps sort of give perspective to the bigger things that are going on around you. And again, allows you to focus inwards and regroup and take a pause, because that's really the key in all of this.
So one of the things that I think is valuable about things like the grounding in your senses, and actually it's kind of a through line to all of the different mindfulness practices, is that you start focusing on something other than what's in your head. You
Right.
get outside your head, because the anxious thoughts are in your head. So literally distraction.
Yep.
And I think in terms of constructive distraction and destructive distraction. And constructive distraction is things like saying, you know, I'm going to pay attention to this series of words that I use as a mantra. I'm going to pay attention to the sounds, the smells, the temperature of the air or the breeze, whatever. So getting outside of our heads is a through line to all of these.
Yeah, I think creative visualization too is another really good one. And what I do with most of my clients who are suffering from anxiety or panic disorders is when we're not in a state of anxiety or panic, when we're just sort of sitting and talking through things, we come up with a scene or a scenario of a safe place, of a place that brings us a sense of well-being, a sense of calmness, and really dig in on it and get all the details in our head so that when we're in a moment of panic or we're in a moment of distress, that's something we can turn to. We can remember that safe place, that place that makes us feel calm, and visualize that. So it's being in your head, but in a completely different way. It's not being in the moment in your head, it's being in a different place in your head. So same kind of concept, but internal.
So before we come back to you, Jen, and talk about navigating the workplace, Michael, I want to go back to you and just talk about a psychological concept, which is important in our field, which is empathy. So how might empathy be especially important and valuable as we start to open up, go out into the world, interact more with people?
I think that's one thing that we're really wrestling with in our culture in general is having empathy. And we're talking about an area where, you know, the divide has been stoked up so much that it's hard to pull forward the empathy. We want to dislike or distrust or think the other side is wrong-headed for a lot of different reasons. And taking a step back, being mindful of your own sentiments and how they're just your sentiments, and understanding other people feel differently. I think allowing yourself to listen to the other person and understand the other person also has a valid point of view, whether or not you disagree with it, or no matter how much you disagree with it, they're your fellow human being. And so having us, and that they are also wrestling with things, and, you know, your discomfort is probably a mirror of their discomfort. So they're feeling the same thing you are. And so allowing yourself to experience that and to understand that. Again, going back to the family event, I was mad at this person. But I also understand where this person was coming from. I understand they have, you know, in their world, there's reasons to hold those beliefs. And so remembering that, reminding myself of that really helped. Mm-hmm. So doing that with our fellow person. Mm-hmm. Also doing that ultimately allows us to experience empathy for ourselves. I think, you know, cueing the other person that you have empathy for them, or that you understand them, or you don't judge them so harshly, allows them to approach you in the same way, which then feels good for you, feels better for you.
So part of what I think you're talking about is a notion that we're all more human than anything else.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're all suffering through this together.
Mm-hmm. So I have an anecdote about empathy from the day that the CDC released its new guidelines saying that if we were vaccinated, we didn't have to wear masks. And I was walking down the street. I was on the phone. I had a mask and it was down around my chin because I was on the phone. And, you know, sometimes the mask can kind of make the sound fuzzier and it's harder for the other person to hear. So I took my mask down. And I'm vaccinated and I'm outside, right? And so I'm thinking, okay, you know, I am not really putting other people at risk. A guy in a wheelchair comes by and he says, put your damn mask on. And I realized that he was afraid, that he felt like my not wearing a mask was putting him in danger. I don't know why he's in a wheelchair. I don't know anything else about him. But what my mind did instantly, thankfully, was I said, he's afraid. That's why he's being aggressive towards me. And he was being aggressive towards me. And I have a concern that if we are not empathic towards other people and we have those kinds of encounters, they could get really ugly, really fast, and have, I mean, literally, we know that there's been violence on airplanes and things, where, people have knocked flight attendants' teeth out and, over masks and stuff. So, it's, when we don't exercise empathy, then I think we can really get into trouble in this kind of situation. Luckily, it just happened to click in for me. It wasn't like I had, there was a long thought process. It just happened to click for me so that I didn't feel like I needed to kind of, bark back at him or something, but it was a very interesting moment, at that particular moment when the guidelines had just been changed. So, and we're still mucking around trying to figure out in the aftermath of those new guidelines. There are inconsistencies between, laws in different areas and between, OSHA regulations and CDC guidelines. And this is a messy time, a messy process that we're in.
Yeah, and people are really struggling. I mean, we're all really struggling with this. And I mean, it's interesting that, as a country in the past, when we've had huge trauma, it's been easier for us to come together, all together, at least for moments of time, and unquestioning unity. So like, 9/11. Even though the political differences ended up coming out, for a while we were all together. It hasn't been so easy to do that with this pandemic, even though we're all suffering.
Yeah. And we're in a period of massive transition, and there can be a sense of excitement about, we get to go out, we get to do things, we get to see people we haven't been able to see for a year or more. And yet, there are these potentially uncomfortable interactions that we have to face more. So Jen, you are Oasis's lead workplace well-being consultant, and you bring to bear your 2 decades of experience as an employment lawyer, which gives you a perspective on what workplaces are like and what managers and HR professionals have to figure out. And you're also a clinical social worker, so you have your insights into interpersonal relationships. And we have this time in which we kind of have this trifecta. So we have some people who are anxious about returning to face-to-face work. Some of them may be clinically anxious. They may have social anxiety. Some of them may have fear of getting COVID in the workplace. They could have both fear of getting COVID in the workplace and social anxiety. We have this situation in which we don't know who's vaccinated. We cannot tell by looking. We have differences of individual opinion and kind of thresholds about what feels safe and what doesn't. People have different practices. Some of those practices are, as we've discussed, politicized. And sometimes it's more just a matter of, that sort of that personal threshold for risk that has nothing to do with politics at all. So we have this enormously difficult moment in time that bears on re-entering the workplace. So with these considerations in mind, how might HR professionals, small business owners, managers cultivate practices that enhance mental well-being during this stressful time and also reduce stress, uncertainty, and interpersonal conflicts?
Sure. Well, I just want to disclaim all of this by saying this should not be construed as legal advice at all. I'm sort of looking at it from a lens of the law as well as from a lens of mental health, but it's certainly not meant to be legal advice per se. My first caveat would be, as an employer, regardless of what it is that you do, you really shouldn't be asking specific questions about why or why not someone has chosen or not chosen to be vaccinated. Whether or not you ask if someone has received the vaccine is a very legitimate thing to be doing. But in terms of what you do after that, so now and you sort of have people fleshed out into these categories, and how do you support people in both camps as an employer? It's meeting people where they are. And I think that's the first step in all of this. Certainly, businesses that have been able to survive and thrive through the pandemic certainly don't want to now be re-entering this phase of no longer being in the pandemic and now losing their workforce and having real issues to contend with in that sense. So it's allowing people to feel what they feel, to hold space with them, and to recognize the good and the value that people bring to your organization, and reward that by allowing people to lean into the things that make them feel comfortable, to speak about the things that make them feel uncomfortable. As a practical matter, whether or not an employer is going to allow their employees to flex time, to be in the office or out of the office, very specific, very personal, something you should be discussing with your legal team. But from a practical standpoint of what to do with it, it's recognizing the need that all of us have for community, and the idea that we haven't had that. Even, being together on Zoom, being together in these sort of one-offs isn't the same thing as having a culture and having that sense of community again. So it's really cultivating that with your employees and finding ways to allow them to connect with one another. In terms of the other question that you asked, Sarah, and I know I'm sort of throwing a bunch of things out here in response, it's the very things that Dr. Losoff spoke of at the beginning, the same things that we would do as individuals to take care of ourselves when we're recognizing feelings of anxiety and feelings of panic come up. It's giving space in the workplace for that too, because ultimately we're all human, and it's recognizing what it is that we're dealing with at any given time. It's allowing employees to set boundaries. It's having boundaries as an employer too, but it's being very forthright and very direct about what it is that you're feeling and leaning into that and sharing that with others. One thing that really strikes me, and it's the sort of thing that we think of too when we think of people who have been on the front lines, or healthcare workers, or anybody else who is right there, the caretakers, the people who are in the throes of it. Well, HR people and managerial staff are now going to be stepping into those roles. They're going to have to be taking care of themselves while at the same time taking care of their workplace and taking care of the people who live in that workplace for those 8 hours a day, however that's going to be. And
also, Jen, it just seems to me there's another huge thing is having to revise and re-revise repeatedly policies and practices that are having to evolve as the circumstances change. So there's an additional sort of burden of work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's recognizing that these changes are happening in real time. So the need to pivot, the need to have sort of flexibility and a dynamic kind of interchange between all parties is essential as well, because it isn't the sort of thing that you can always prepare for beforehand too. Things are going to be coming up, and the need to keep revising and reworking and retooling is paramount in all of that.
So one of the things you're talking about, in addition to a kind of a need for flexibility in things like, redesigning people's jobs, right? So that they can do a hybrid, say. You're talking about having kinds of conversations that I imagine both employees and employers are not used to having, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, there's some basic kinds of things that could be, at the level of, so how are you doing, right? And kind of like, how are you doing really, right?
Yeah.
But you're saying it kind of needs to get more nitty gritty than that, right? This is not the sort of, hey, how you doing kind of thing, right? The sort of greeting and passing, right? Like there's a different kind of conversation that is probably going to feel unfamiliar on both sides. So if we think of it in terms of the, say, the manager or the HR professional side, how might you start such a conversation with somebody where you want to give them permission to be able to talk about personal experiences that for the most part people don't necessarily bring to work, right?
It's modeling that. It's really bringing people in and assuring them that you're looking to connect with them on a very human level. And if that is done by anecdotally sharing something of yourself at the get-go to set the stage, to show that this is actually a safe space to do that, then that's the way. It's all very dependent on a particular culture, on a chemistry between the two people. And again, it's just meeting people where they're at. And it's saying, this is designed to be helpful to you. The intent here is to have a collaborative process. The intent here is to make this work. So what can we do together to meet your needs? What is it that you need? Not, I'm fine, everything's fine, it's all good. But really, what do we need to do to get you to perform optimally, to feel emotionally connected to what you're doing, and to address the lower T trauma that everyone is dealing with?
And what about getting into questions of like the real kind of indicators at a kind of concrete behavioral level, if you will, of how somebody's doing? So like, would you say that a manager or HR professional might say, how are you sleeping? Or, what kind of hours are you keeping? Like, when do you turn your laptop off? Where is your laptop? Would you go to bed? Like, would you recommend going into that level of concrete, specific detail?
I think, again, it really depends on the comfort level of your employee and that relationship. I think those are exactly the questions that we as clinicians would look at to determine how someone is functioning, your eating, your sleeping, your self-care, all of those things. It's recognizing, though, the comfort level that someone has in sharing that. You can ask that more generally too. You can put it in terms of, are there areas in which you're struggling? You don't need to be necessarily as specific about it, but those are exactly the hallmarks of someone who would be struggling. Those would be the things that you're looking for. And, it's the sort of thing too, where you might not at the get-go be addressing it with someone until you really notice that there is something that's coming up in the workplace, that there's something that's just off. And then it's approaching that employee to see how it is that you can best help them. Different people, again, have different comfort levels.
Mm-hmm. Would you say, as a general rule of thumb, that managers, small business owners, HR professionals might be well served to be asking people more often, checking in?
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think that actually would be a wonderful first step, to have that be just sort of the general dialogue, to just put it out there. And if you feel comfortable, and again, workplace specific to be sure, but if you feel comfortable enough to be putting that out there to your employees, to sort of run through these like checklist that you're sort of widely distributing to people, and then taking that information and seeing where people are struggling and how you can best help them meet those areas of deficit.
Mhm. So I want to run through a particular scenario that was raised by, I am seeing articles and hearing things on the news almost every day about the challenges of re-entering face-to-face work environments now. And the ethicist column in the New York Times this past weekend was posed this question of, I'm going back to work and I'm worried about who's vaccinated and who's not. Can I ask my coworkers if they're vaccinated? The ethicist's answer was yes. That in this instance, because it's not just a private matter, it's a public health matter, you are entitled to ask. But the ethicist stopped there, right? So,
Exactly.
so what I want to ask you, because you have this experience as a mental health professional about navigating sometimes challenging conversations, how would you advise an employee that they initiate such a conversation?
Well, so I agree with the ethicist in that it should be sort of just a yes or no kind of response. I think where I might disagree is in the asking. I think that if you have concerns as an employee, and again, I want to just put a caveat out there that it depends on the workspace, depends on the size of the company, but if there's enough of sort of an institutional cushion, it's going to HR and saying, these are the parameters in which I feel comfortable working, and allowing the HR professional who may have access to all that knowledge to then go ahead and maybe switch your workspace without telling you why, without telling you who, without disclosing that information. As an employer, I would never recommend that my employees are having these discussions back and forth. I think it can, again, lead to all sorts of potential legal landmines. So I think there's artful ways for employers to protect the needs of their employees while still addressing the privacy concerns of other people as well.
Mhm.
But it's a really complicated area. And it's certainly something that as an HR professional or as a business owner, you want to be able to hold with your employees because it's very stressful. And for some people, that's a capital T trauma. Maybe they lost someone. Maybe they have someone who's been on the front line or a long hauler. You just have no idea.
Yeah. One of the other things that I've been seeing in the news is as recently as this last Friday, June 3rd, there was an article about people in customer-facing jobs feeling like with the relaxing of the mask requirements, that literally this one person said, I think she worked in a grocery store, she said, we feel like sitting ducks.
Yep.
We don't know who's vaccinated and we don't know who's not. Clearly, this person is describing a very high stress level for herself in going to work every day. So I want to have you look at this from both the standpoint of an employee who's in that situation where they feel very vulnerable,
Yeah.
and it's a major source of stress. What would you advise the employee who is feeling like they got to interact with the public, they don't know who's vaccinated or not, lots of people are not wearing masks. So what would you advise an employer in that situation? Not as an attorney, but as, again.
Yeah, right. As a mental health professional dealing with an employee who would be on the front line and would be terrified the way you're describing, it's sort of the combination of finding ways that they can reclaim their power and also mantras they can be saying to themselves. So what I mean by that is reminding the person who is feeling vulnerable, if they have been vaccinated, that you've been vaccinated, you've taken the steps you need to take. You can wear PPE if you need to, if that makes you feel safer. You can do all of the things that keep yourself safe in that way. And then the issue of whether or not someone has or has not been vaccinated, really becomes more moot because you've taken the steps to protect yourself. Now that's an issue of whatever these people are doing or not doing, that's a safety concern that they're going to need to contend with. It doesn't take away the stress level of having to wonder about it, but in terms of like your own personal safety and those types of real concerns about health that might be coming up, it's a reframing. And it's, you know, and I was working on this actually with someone who is a medical worker, just talking about like, what can you say to yourself in these moments of high stress to reclaim that sense of control and that sense of personal power, because that's really what ends up going by the wayside. And that's what people are grappling for. So that's how I would answer that from a mental health perspective for the employee.
And for an employee, would you say, in addition to those are strategies about kind of empowering yourself, right? Controlling what you can, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Would you advise them to go to their management, to go to HR with their concerns that they feel like they may be at risk?
Absolutely. I mean, I think though the unfortunate reality of being in some of these positions, absolutely advocate for yourself. Absolutely tell HR, tell your employer, tell who you need to tell. But at the end of the day, some of these jobs, it's just part of the job. And that's really hard to deal with. And that's a real unfortunate reality of it. But absolutely, if you feel unsafe or you feel like it isn't a situation that you feel like you can adequately perform the duties of your job, then absolutely advocate for yourself. But in terms of the personal empowerment piece, I feel like that's the one piece and the one area that can be modulated and can be controlled regardless of the situation.
So I said I was going to pose it to you in both respects. So one is the employee, right, who's faced with this situation. And the other is the person who's more of a decision maker. And
right.
What can they do in their role to help their employees?
So I think valuing your employees and I think allowing them to the extent that you can to set parameters, to set different expectations, to say this is something I am comfortable doing and this is something I'm not comfortable doing. It's hard to speak in generalities because there is so much variation in every workplace. So right now I'm picturing of someone who's checking people out at a grocery line. There isn't that much an employer can do in terms of the actual job duty itself. That just is what it is. But maybe it's saying to that employee, we're going to give you more breaks. We're going to give you time to come back, to go outside, to get some fresh air, to kind of regroup, things like that, where you can take care of your employees without changing the fundamental duties of a position that you might not be able to as an employer as much as you might want to.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked quite a bit about kind of what employers can do, the managers, the business owners, the HR professionals. Yeah. And we touched in passing early on the fact that people who are in decision-making roles have positions of responsibility in a workplace in this moment in time are under extraordinary amounts of stress that are unprecedented, right? Running a workplace, if you will, is much, much more complicated. And there's a lot of fluid considerations that in themselves are a source of stress. So what would you say to people in those kinds of jobs, which have become more stressful than they were, however stressful they were before, they are probably exponentially more stressful. What would you say to people in those kinds of positions about what kind of support they need, you know, to get through their day so that they don't burn out?
It's the same thing. I mean, I think all of us, regardless of our job title, regardless of the position that we hold, right now, we have to all be hyper vigilant in focusing in on what our needs are and what's really going on inside of us. And it's advocating, it's speaking your truth, it's asking for help when you need it, and looking for places of support when you can find it. And I think that just goes across the board regardless. I think that there is sort of this notion in our society, just kind of like suck it up and keep going. And that really isn't going to fly right now, not in this climate, not in this health climate or political climate. It's recognizing that you have needs, that you are human, and that you have to address those things before you can address anything else.
So in a sense, people who have these positions of responsibility need to remind themselves that they're only human too, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And I'm thinking that it may be difficult for many people in those positions to sort of say, I'm human, and yes, I have all these people in a sense that I need to take care of, I need to tend to, right? I need to put out fires, you know, all that kind of stuff. I need to rewrite the policies. But that it may be difficult for some of them to say, I need other people
Yeah,
that I can talk to, that I can turn to.
absolutely. I think it is really hard for a lot of people, but I also think it's really essential. And I think the more that we're all out here talking about it and putting it into sort of the public discourse, hopefully the more comfortable people will get in asking for it, because they'll realize that it's a universal need. It's not weak. It's not a sign of anything other than, frankly, being emotionally in touch with who you are and recognizing what it is that you need to perform to the best that you can, emotionally and otherwise.
And just being human.
Exactly.
So I want to go out on a different note. We are going to post on the screen a tweet. This tweet was posted by someone who works at what is now called the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab here in Chicago, formerly known as and still often referred to as the Rehab Institute of Chicago. This was forwarded to me by Gail Horvath, who is our marketing consultant, and I'm very grateful. So tweet is posted by an employee at Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, and he is remarking about what a cool place this is to work. Because the message is really about, you know, taking care of yourself, checking in with yourself, checking in. It's encouraging employees to check in with other people they work with. That's something we talked about. Checking in with yourself, going to somebody in a position higher than yourself, and if you need help, seeking it out, acknowledging, you know, your contributions in your workplace, remembering things that went well today, so kind of maybe correcting for some sense of feeling depleted or burned out or whatever. And then, you know, the final message is now switch your attention to hum, rest and recharge, right? So this is a workplace that is saying, in our culture, you don't take your work home with you. You get to go home and do whatever you need to do on your personal time. So there's a boundary between work and home. And I think this is clearly the person who works there feels pretty great about it. But I think it's a pretty wonderful checklist, not just to post on a wall, but to think in terms of sort of like creating a culture, right? That communicates that we look out for each other, you know? That kind of, it's a wrap around, you know, we look out for each other. So I thought it was sort of a great note to end on, because it's sort of, it says pretty close to perfectly. It kind of says it all, you know?
It sure does.
Ties the whole conversation together.